Mrs. Lillian Harper was a kind, elderly woman who lived at the edge of town in a cozy little house with a small garden. Her home was simple but full of charm. She loved tending to her flowers, feeding the birds, and baking cookies for the neighborhood children. Even though Mrs. Harper was one of the few black residents in the predominantly white town, she was well known for her warm smile and generous heart. Most people in the town liked her, but not everyone treated her with the same respect. Some teenagers in the area, feeling restless and looking for something to do, often talked about Mrs. Harper in ways that weren't very kind. They didn't really know her. They just saw her as someone who was different. They made fun of her quiet ways and sometimes teased her from afar, but Mrs. Harper never let their actions bother her. She believed in kindness and always hoped they would grow up to be better people. One warm evening in the early summer, Mrs. Harper sat on her porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and everything felt calm. She hummed a hymn her mother used to sing, thinking about how peaceful life could be if people just treated one another with kindness. She didn't notice the group of teenagers walking past her house, whispering and pointing. They had started spending more time together, bored and eager to find something exciting to do. The teenagers weren't bad kids deep down, but they were influenced by their surroundings and the attitudes they had grown up around. They didn't stop to think about how their words or actions might hurt others. That evening, they talked about playing a prank. "Let's do something daring," one of them said. "Something we can talk about forever." The others agreed, laughing as they brainstormed ideas. What started as a silly conversation quickly turned into something more serious. One of the teenagers suggested targeting Mrs. Harper because she wouldn't do anything about it. The group laughed nervously, not fully realizing how far their actions could go. They thought it would just be harmless fun, a little scare to make them feel bold. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper went inside her home and locked the door, as she always did before bed. She felt safe in her house, surrounded by the things she loved. Her walls were lined with photographs of family and friends, reminders of a life full of love and joy. She had no idea that outside, the teenagers were planning something that would soon disrupt her quiet life. The town had always seemed peaceful, but beneath the surface, unspoken tensions were beginning to grow. This was just the start of a story that would change not only Mrs. Harper's life, but also the entire community. The next day, the teenagers gathered in their usual spot near the park. They laughed and joked, their conversations full of energy, but their excitement wasn't coming from anything positive. One of them, Ryan, brought up the idea they had talked about the night before. "Let's do something unforgettable," he said, his eyes shining with mischief. "Something we'll talk about for years." The others, eager to impress and feel like part of the group, nodded. "But what?" asked Mia, the youngest of the group. She wasn't sure about all this but didn't want to seem like the boring one. Ryan smirked. "You remember that old lady, Mrs. Harper? The one who always sits on her porch. Let's prank her. Nothing bad, just to scare her a little. It'll be hilarious." The group hesitated. Everyone in town knew Mrs. Harper was kind and never caused trouble. "She's harmless," said Jason, another member of the group. "Why her?" Ryan shrugged. "That's the point. She won't do anything. It's not like we're hurting anyone. It's just a joke." Some of them laughed nervously, unsure if they wanted to go along with the idea. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, and no one wanted to be the one who said no. Soon, they were brainstorming ideas for what they thought would be a harmless prank. They talked about things like ringing her doorbell and running away or hiding her garden tools. As they spoke, their ideas became bolder, fueled by the thrill of doing something secretive and rebellious. Each suggestion was a little riskier than the last. "Let's do something that really scares her," Ryan said. His confidence pushed the group further than they had originally intended. Mia, still uneasy, spoke up. "What if it goes too far? We don't want to get in trouble." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Relax, Mia. It's just for fun. No one's getting hurt. The group spent the rest of the day planning. They decided to wait until late at night when Mrs. Harper would be asleep. Their plan wasn't fully formed, but they were confident they could improvise when the time came. They weren't thinking about how their actions might affect Mrs. Harper. They were only thinking about the thrill they would feel and the stories they could tell afterward. As the sun set, the teenagers met up, bringing flashlights and whispering excitedly. They crept toward Mrs. Harper's house, their laughter hushed but still present. The night was quiet, and the air was cool. Everything seemed still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Mrs. Harper, meanwhile, had already gone to bed. She had no idea what was about to happen, no clue that a group of restless teenagers was heading her way with a plan they thought was harmless but would soon spiral out of control. The group didn't know it yet, but their actions that night would have consequences far beyond what any of them could imagine. The night was calm as the teenagers approached Mrs. Harper's house. The moonlight lit up the quiet street, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and their own footsteps on the gravel road. They had decided to act quickly, hoping to carry out their plan before anyone noticed. The air felt thick with excitement, but no one in the group fully understood what they were about to do. Ryan led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He reached the front door of Mrs. Harper's house first, and the others quickly gathered around. They were all nervous, but Ryan encouraged them. "Come on, it's just a prank. Don't be scared." Mia stood back, feeling more uncomfortable by the minute. She wasn't sure what had happened to the harmless joke they had originally planned. The other teenagers were too caught up in the thrill of the moment to notice her hesitation. The plan had changed. No longer was it about a simple scare or a quick joke. Ryan had decided they would go a step further. He knew they had to act fast, and they had to make it memorable. It wasn't about just ringing a doorbell anymore. "Let's take her somewhere she can't get away from," Ryan suggested with a grin. "Let's just teach her a lesson." At first, the others stared at him, unsure. But Ryan's confidence pushed them forward. They quickly made their way to the backyard, where Mrs. Harper kept her garden tools and a small shed. In the dark, they carefully peered around her house. Mrs. Harper's porch light was off, and her windows were closed. The house was quiet. She was definitely asleep. The group carefully made their way around the side of the house and found Mrs. Harper sitting in her garden shed, sorting through some old tools. She didn't notice them until it was too late. Ryan quickly grabbed her by the wrist. "Come with us," he ordered in a low voice, trying not to wake anyone. Mrs. Harper, startled, gasped. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. "What is this? What are you doing?" she asked in confusion. But they didn't answer. Mia, who had been standing quietly in the back, finally stepped forward. "This isn't funny," she whispered, feeling a rush of guilt. But Ryan was already moving forward, pushing the group to take the next step. The teenagers weren't thinking clearly anymore. Their adrenaline was clouding their judgment. They moved Mrs. Harper to a nearby field, away from the safety of her home. In the darkness, as Mrs. Harper tried to resist, she was forced to the ground. The situation was spiraling out of control. What had started as a harmless prank had turned into something far worse. None of the teenagers, including Ryan, fully understood how deeply they had crossed a line. They had become caught up in the thrill, the power of the moment. And in that instant, they lost sight of what was truly important, the safety and respect of another human being. As Mrs. Harper was left lying on the ground, her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to survive. She had to find a way to get out of this, to somehow escape. The night had turned from a peaceful evening to one of fear and confusion. The night air was thick with tension as Mrs. Harper lay on the cold ground, feeling a mix of fear and confusion. She could hardly believe what had just happened. One moment, she had been safely inside her home, and now she was far from everything she knew and loved, surrounded by strange, whispering voices. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. But Mrs. Harper was not just any elderly woman. She was strong, both in body and spirit. Over the years, she had faced many challenges in her life, and she had learned how to keep calm in moments of great stress. She knew that if she let panic take over, she might not find a way out. So as she lay there in the dark, she focused on one thing: surviving. She could hear the teenagers talking, but their words didn't make much sense. They were still excited, still caught up in the chaos of the moment. They hadn't fully realized how serious things had become. Mrs. Harper knew she had to act quickly. Her first priority was to stay still and listen. She needed to understand what they were planning next. As she lay in the dirt, she heard them laughing, not realizing the fear that gripped her heart. She knew they were only half aware of how dangerous this was. They weren't trying to hurt her, at least not in the way they might have planned. But they were still putting her in a terrible situation. For a moment, the world felt like it was spinning. The ground was cold beneath her, and the weight of fear pressed on her chest. But Mrs. Harper kept her breathing slow and steady. She was not going to let fear take control. After a few minutes, she slowly began to move her fingers. She was lying on her side, and the earth was packed tight around her. Her arms and legs ached, but she pushed through the discomfort. She wasn't about to give up. She had survived so much in her life. She wasn't going to let this be the end. Her fingers touched something. It was a small twig half buried in the soil. She used it to scratch at the dirt around her. Slowly, she began to create small gaps in the dirt that had been piled on top of her. Every movement felt like it took all her strength, but she didn't stop. She was determined to escape. The voices of the teenagers began to fade as they moved away. It was her chance. Mrs. Harper took a deep breath and pushed herself upward. The earth was heavy, but she had found a small opening. Slowly, with steady determination, she clawed at the ground, inching her way to freedom. The cool night air filled her lungs as she made her escape. She wasn't sure how long it had been since they buried her, but she didn't care. She was free. When Mrs. Harper finally stood, she was weak and shaken, but she felt a rush of triumph. The night had been terrifying, but her survival instinct had carried her through. As she looked around, trying to get her bearings, she realized she had made it. She had escaped. Now, Mrs. Harper had only one thing on her mind: getting back to safety and finding help. The teenagers had no idea what she had just done, and she wasn't about to let them get away with it. But for now, she was focused on getting home. As Mrs. Harper made her way back home, the fear and confusion she had felt earlier began to melt away. Her body ached, and her clothes were dirty from the dirt and leaves she had struggled through. But her determination kept her going. She wasn't sure how long it took, but after what seemed like an eternity, she finally reached the edge of her yard. Her heart raced with relief as she stepped onto her familiar property. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her. It felt like a small victory, but she knew it was only the beginning. Mrs. Harper was shaken, but her mind was already racing. What had just happened? Why would the teenagers do something like that? And most importantly, what should she do next? She quickly found her phone and dialed the police. Her hands trembled as she explained what had happened, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and anger. "I've just been attacked," she told them, trying to stay calm despite the emotions bubbling inside her. "A group of teenagers. They buried me alive. Please, I need help." The police officer on the other end of the line was immediately concerned and promised to send officers to her home right away. Mrs. Harper sat down on her couch, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. It was hard to believe that such a terrible thing had just happened in her own peaceful neighborhood. As the news began to spread, the community's reaction was mixed. Some people were horrified and quickly rallied around Mrs. Harper, offering their support. They couldn't believe that something like this could happen in their town, and many people took to social media to express their outrage and demand justice. Local leaders and activists began to speak out, calling for change and for the teenagers involved to face the consequences of their actions. However, not everyone reacted the same way. There were also whispers and murmurs of disbelief. Some people, especially those who had always been uncomfortable with Mrs. Harper's presence in the neighborhood, didn't know what to make of the situation. They questioned how much of the story was true or suggested that it was an accident. There were even a few who tried to downplay what had happened, suggesting that the teenagers were just acting out and that things had gotten out of hand. Mrs. Harper heard these comments, and it hurt. She had always been kind to everyone, always tried to make the community a better place. But now, some people seemed more interested in protecting the teenagers than in understanding the pain and fear she had experienced. It made her feel isolated, but she refused to let it bring her down. She knew what had happened, and she would not stay silent. As the day went on, the police arrived at her home to take her statement. They asked her to describe what had happened and to provide any details that might help them find the teenagers responsible. Mrs. Harper, though still shaken, did her best to recount the events of that night. It was clear that the teenagers had made a terrible mistake, but Mrs. Harper couldn't help but wonder, what would happen now? Would they face the consequences of their actions? And would the community stand together to support her and ensure that something like this would never happen again? The morning after Mrs. Harper's terrifying ordeal, the police were hard at work investigating what had happened. The town was buzzing with gossip, and people couldn't stop talking about the shocking events that had taken place. But while many were still processing the horror of it all, the police were focused on one thing: finding the teenagers responsible. Detectives arrived at Mrs. Harper's home early in the morning. They spoke with her about the details of the night, asking her to remember everything she could. Mrs. Harper, still shaken but determined, answered their questions as best as she could. She described the sound of footsteps, the voices of the teenagers, and the fear she felt when they grabbed her. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this was not a harmless prank gone wrong. It was something far more serious. While Mrs. Harper provided her statement, other officers were already gathering evidence. They went to the wooded area where she had been left and started to search for any clues. The ground was still disturbed, and they found traces of her struggle, small pieces of her clothing, the broken branches, and the marks where she had clawed her way out of the dirt. The police also spoke with witnesses who had been near the neighborhood that night. A couple of neighbors reported seeing a group of teenagers walking together around the time of the incident. Their statements helped the officers narrow down the group of suspects. Soon, the police had enough information to begin questioning the teenagers. One by one, they were brought in for interviews. At first, the teens denied any involvement, trying to act like nothing had happened. They seemed nervous, but they claimed they had been doing nothing more than messing around. They tried to downplay their actions, calling it just a silly joke that had gotten out of hand. But the evidence told a different story. As the officers dug deeper, they discovered that the group of teenagers had been planning something much more serious than they had let on. A few of them had shared messages online, discussing their plans and how they would prank Mrs. Harper. They had even talked about the idea of taking her out into the woods, making her scared, and laughing about it later. Ryan, the leader of the group, was the first to crack. Under pressure from the police, he admitted to the crime. He was young, but the weight of what he had done finally caught up with him. He broke down and confessed to everything. His friends, one by one, followed suit. They each admitted to their roles in the event, though they all claimed they never meant for things to go as far as they did. The police were shocked by their lack of remorse. Even though they admitted to the crime, the teenagers seemed to have little understanding of the seriousness of what they had done. Some of them even tried to make excuses, blaming their actions on peer pressure or saying they were just following along with Ryan. The investigation continued, but it was clear that the teenagers had crossed a line. This wasn't just a prank, it was an attack. The authorities had no choice but to move forward with legal action. Mrs. Harper had been brave enough to survive and stand up for herself, and now it was time for justice to take its course. As the news spread, the community began to take notice. People began to ask difficult questions about how something like this could happen in their small, peaceful town. But for now, The focus was on holding the teenagers accountable and making sure Mrs. Harper's story was heard. The trial of the teenagers accused of attacking Mrs. Harper began a few months after the incident. The small town had never seen anything like it before. The courtroom was packed with people, eager to know what would happen next. Mrs. Harper, though still recovering from her ordeal, had decided to attend the trial to make sure her voice was heard. She wanted to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been hurt by hate or cruelty. The teenagers sat in the defendant's row, their faces a mix of nervousness and regret. They had spent months reflecting on what they had done, but the weight of their actions was something they could not undo. Their family sat nearby, looking anxious and uncomfortable. It was clear that no one was prepared for what the trial would reveal. The prosecution began by laying out the facts of the case. They presented evidence, including the statements from Mrs. Harper and the teenagers' confessions. The evidence showed that the teenagers had planned the attack carefully and that their actions went far beyond a simple prank. They had hurt someone, and it was not something that could be brushed aside. Mrs. Harper was called to the witness stand. She was nervous, but she knew that speaking up was the only way to make sure the truth was heard. When she took the stand, everyone in the courtroom fell silent. Mrs. Harper, her hands trembling slightly, looked directly at the judge and spoke clearly. "I've lived a long life," she began, "and I have faced many challenges. But nothing prepared me for the fear I felt that night. I never thought anyone would do something like that to me. I've always tried to treat others with kindness, but now I see that not everyone does the same." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. The courtroom was filled with the sounds of people quietly sniffling or wiping away tears. Mrs. Harper didn't hold back as she explained how the attack had affected her. She spoke about the fear she felt, but she also talked about how important it was to forgive and learn from mistakes. "As hard as it has been for me," she continued, "I believe people can change. I want to believe these young people can grow and learn from this mistake, but they must face the consequences of their actions, because it was wrong. What they did hurt me, and it hurt this community." The teenagers sat quietly as Mrs. Harper spoke. They looked down at the floor, clearly ashamed. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting to hear how the judge would respond to Mrs. Harper's testimony. Next, the defense team tried to argue that the teenagers were simply acting out of immaturity and that they didn't fully understand the seriousness of their actions. They claimed the group was just messing around and that they didn't intend to hurt anyone. But the prosecution was firm. Their actions were not just reckless, they were harmful, and they could not be dismissed as a simple mistake. When the time came for the verdict, the courtroom was tense. Everyone had been waiting for this moment, hoping for justice. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The teenagers were found guilty, though the judge took into account their age and the fact that they had shown some remorse. They were sentenced to community service, counseling, and probation, with the hope that they would learn from their actions and become better people. As the trial ended, Mrs. Harper felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the outcome she had expected, but it was a step in the right direction. She had stood up for herself, and now she hoped that the teenagers would learn from their mistakes and never hurt anyone again. The trial was over, but the conversation about forgiveness, change, and accountability had just begun. After the trial, Mrs. Harper spent some time reflecting on everything that had happened. The weeks that followed were filled with a mix of emotions: relief that the truth had been told, sadness for the hurt she had endured, and hope that the teenagers involved would learn and grow from the experience. The town, too, began to reflect. The court case had shaken everyone. People were talking more openly about the issues of kindness, respect, and understanding. Mrs. Harper's courage in speaking out had inspired many in the community to take a hard look at how they treated one another. Even though she had been hurt, she had chosen to be forgiving, to focus on healing rather than holding on to anger. In the months after the trial, some of the teenagers who had been involved in the incident started to change. Ryan, the leader of the group, was the first to reach out to Mrs. Harper. He wrote her a letter, apologizing for his actions and admitting that he had not fully understood the consequences of what he had done. "I never realized how much my actions could hurt someone," Ryan wrote. "I'm truly sorry for what I did. I wish I could take it all back, but I know I can't. I just want you to know that I will do my best to make things right." Mrs. Harper, touched by his words, wrote back to him. She told him that she believed people could change and that she hoped he would make better choices in the future. She encouraged him to learn from this mistake and use his experiences to help others. It was a simple message of hope and forgiveness, but it meant a lot to both of them. As the months went by, Ryan and the other teenagers continued their community service and counseling. They worked with local organizations, helping with youth programs, and doing volunteer work. At first, it felt like a punishment to them, but slowly they began to understand the importance of giving back to the community and learning from their mistakes. They began to realize how much their actions had affected not just Mrs. Harper, but the entire town. Mrs. Harper's health had improved as well. Though she still had moments when the memories of that night came back to her, she felt stronger than ever. She had learned that no matter what life threw at her, she had the strength to survive and to find a way forward. She started speaking at local schools, sharing her story with young people, hoping to make them understand the importance of kindness and how even small actions could have big consequences. Through her work, Mrs. Harper became a symbol of forgiveness and resilience in the community. Her story showed that justice was not only about punishment, but also about learning from mistakes and making amends. She believed that everyone deserved a chance to grow and become better, no matter their past. In the end, Mrs. Harper's journey was one of strength, courage, and hope. Her experience had changed her, but it had also changed the town. And though the scars of that night would never fully fade, they became a reminder to everyone that kindness and understanding could heal even the deepest wounds. Years had passed since the night that had changed Mrs. Harper's life and the lives of those around her. The small town, once shaken by the events, had slowly started to heal. The teenagers who had caused her so much pain had grown, learned, and become different people. But it wasn't just them who had changed. It was the entire community. Mrs. Harper had become more than just a survivor of that terrible night. She had become a symbol of courage and forgiveness. She continued to live in the same cozy home, tending to her garden and enjoying her peaceful life, but she was also more active in the community than ever. She attended local meetings, spoke at schools, and worked with organizations that focused on kindness, respect, and second chances. Her story had inspired so many people, young and old alike. It wasn't just about what had happened to her, but about how she had chosen to respond. She hadn't let anger or fear control her. Instead, she had chosen to forgive and to encourage others to learn from their mistakes. One afternoon, Mrs. Harper stood before a group of students at the local high school. She had been invited to speak about her life and the lessons she had learned. As she stood at the front of the classroom, looking at the faces of the young people in front of her, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew her story could make a difference in their lives. "I want you to know something," she began, her voice calm and steady. "We all make mistakes. We all have moments we regret. But it's not the mistake that defines us. It's how we choose to move forward from it." The students listened closely, hanging on to her every word. Mrs. Harper shared the painful memories of that night, but she also spoke about the importance of growth and change. She told them about the teenagers who had hurt her and how, over time, they had worked hard to make things right. She explained how she had forgiven them, not because they deserved it, but because forgiveness was a gift she gave herself. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she said. "It means choosing peace over pain. It means letting go of the past so you can make room for a better future." Her words stuck with the students. Many of them came up to her afterward, thanking her for sharing her story. Some of them even apologized for things they had done in the past, realizing that they, too, had things to work on. Mrs. Harper smiled, knowing that her words had made a difference. The town, too, had learned valuable lessons from what had happened. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder that kindness and respect must always come first. The community had become more united, more compassionate. People began to pay more attention to one another, and small acts of kindness became a regular part of life. The teenagers who had been involved in the incident had grown into young adults who now actively worked to make the world a better place, just as Mrs. Harper had encouraged them to. Even after all these years, Mrs. Harper's story continued to resonate. Her legacy wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving and helping others to do the same. She had shown that even in the darkest of times, there was always room for light, for growth, and for change. Mrs. Harper had not only changed her own life, she had changed the lives of everyone who had heard her story. Her journey of courage, forgiveness, and hope would be remembered for generations to come, and it would inspire others to always choose love over hate, understanding over judgment, and kindness over cruelty.